Thank you so much, everyone, for having me here today. And thank you to Annie, especially. Annie just contacted me via email the other day asking if I could step in. And I'm very happy to support such a wonderful society here. What I want to talk about today is something that's very near and dear to my heart. And it's the concept of extinction, particularly. Sorry? Is it on? Oh, Mike. Oh, sorry. I haven't turned the mic on. The concept of extinction, particularly the extinction that occurred in exactly the same geological period of time that we're living in at the moment. So we call that the Quaternary. So the Quaternary started around about 2.5 million years ago and literally goes to this very second that we're sitting in this room at the moment. So we're in the Quaternary itself. So the sort of organisms I'm not going to be talking about are things like dinosaurs and trilobites and anything that lived millions and millions of years ago and went extinct long before where we are at the moment itself. But I want to talk about the organisms that persisted up until very close to where we are in time at the moment. Now, I don't know if people have had the opportunity to see this, but earlier this year, there was a wonderful ABC Catalyst documentary that came out all about the extinction of what we call the Ice Age megafauna. Can I just see, out of curiosity, how many people have seen that, any chance? All right, so we went probably about, maybe 40% or so. So that's really cool. Now, ABC Catalyst had been working on that particular program for several years, and I feel very lucky to have been part of that program itself. So I was a consultant on the series across the last few years, and that's where I want to talk about today, some of the background to where that program came from, and then particularly delving into the question of things like extinction itself, like what happened to these organisms that I'll introduce you to in just a second, and what do we know, and then what do we not know at the moment. I also want to share some unpublished research with everybody of things that I've been working on in the last few years itself. So things that nobody else will know about, or barely anyone will know. So I want to do that a little. Now, one of the problems I have a lot of times with paleontology is when I talk to people, whether they're students in my class or just members of the public, I ask them to give me a couple of names of some extinct animals known only from fossils, and you get the usual kind of suspects, the T-Rex, the Stegosaurus, the Triceratops, and they're fine and valid kind of names. But what I hate about it is that they're all dinosaurs, firstly, and these are things that lived tens of millions or more than 100 million years ago in one of those cases there. And none of them are Australian itself. They're all North American. So it seems to be a case that most people in Australia know more about extinct things that existed at other times across other parts of the planet than what we know about the fossils beneath our own feet here. And that's what I really loved about this show, where it showcased what we have here in Australia and put them in the front of the public. Now, if anybody is super keen to see it, all you have to do is QR scan that code, or if you want to go and do this later, just Google something like ABC iView Megafauna, and you'll be able to find links to be able to watch this online on an app or anything like that. And it's free if you're in Australia to go and watch this at the moment. So it comes in a 2-part series. And my involvement in this started probably 2 or 3 years ago. And I got a phone call one day from a guy called Oliver Graham. And Ollie called me up, and he was a researcher working on this idea about putting a megafauna documentary together for Catalyst. And he was really at the beginning of his journey. And he called me up and he said, oh, we've been speaking to that person over there and they've told us this. We've been talking to another person over here and they've told me that. And he shared some of his research that he had done up until that point in time with me. And it was a funny kind of conversation. And the phone call went for about 2 or 3 hours, which is kind of a weird, long phone call for someone like me to have, because most of my phone calls are about 30 seconds, not 2 or 3 hours. But we spoke for a long time. And what I was responding to him about was when he said a particular aspect of what we know about what happened to the megafauna, I'd respond back saying, no, we don't know that. We haven't got that kind of information on our fingertips at the moment to be able to do this. Then he'd throw something else at me and I say, no, we don't know that either. And so where Ollie had been approaching things in my field across the last 15 or so years, maybe 15 or 20 years, a lot of people have been working in this whole extinction space, but not from the perspective of somebody on the ground, not from the perspective of, for example, a paleontologist like me, not from the perspective of someone who's walking around in the environment, digging things up, dating the fossils back in the lab, not from the perspective of any archaeology and evidence in the ground itself. But they were talking to people who have kind of come into the field, often very big names in their own fields, and they might be ecologists or statisticians. And what they tend to do across that last 15 or 20 years is basically, rather than generate new data, they mine the literature, the published literature, looking for ways that they can quantify aspects to do with the extinction, and then run these fancy kind of statistical models to show you exactly what we know happened to these things. Now, the sort of data that these other scientists are mostly interested in are things like dates. So knowing how old fossils are, and if you know how old a fossil is, you might be able to test it against the leading extinction hypothesis, like did humans wipe them out when they came into Australia 60 or so thousand years ago? If it happens to be a case that all of the megafauna went extinct or drop out of the fossil record at 60,000 years, you might be able to have a nice kind of correlation that might form a cause in that particular instance. If the extinctions were tied to things like climatic changes, then again, you might have it tied to maybe climate driving the loss of these amazing animals that you just saw on the screen a second ago. But the problem with a lot of this stuff, that from my perspective as a paleontologist, is a lot of times, how do I just say this? A lot of times I'll find errors that are being propagated and promulgated through the scientific literature where it comes to that basic data mining itself. So there's issues regarding the way that people interpret taxonomy, so the way that scientific names are applied to these organisms. There's issues in interpreting things like dates, and I'm very lucky to have experience where I not only dig bones up, but I work on the dating side of things back in the laboratory itself. So lots of these issues with the data sets themselves, and because there's issues with the data sets, you can't like take, average data and turn it into something magical, right? And that kind of is what was happening. And they're the people that Ollie was talking to as part of his work. And so it's very confusing for Ollie when he was saying, oh, well, I spoke to these people who are the experts over here, and they've said all these things. Now you're saying that that's not correct. And so we ended the phone call. And this is sort of, if you can imagine, I can't remember exactly when it was, maybe 2021 or 22. So sort of during COVID itself. So this is a bit of a COVID project for Ollie. But he ended up calling me back. I can't remember exactly when, maybe about March or so of last year. And he said, Gilbert, I want to talk to you about that documentary I was talking about putting together. And he said that after that phone call, which is kind of like a bit jarring for him, he ended up going to talk to other people who were working specifically in the field. So people working on the ground, people digging up fossils, people working in the dating laboratories, people working on things like biomechanics, so looking at how organisms move their arms and can walk around the landscape. And he says, I absolutely see where you're coming from now. The story and the narrative that he's got from all these other people was not consistent with some of the narrative that had been pushed forward in a lot of the scientific literature. And that was kind of a striking thing for me. So I was a scientific consultant with the program across that time. We did a little bit of filming together in a couple of field sites. But one of the things I really love is that everything that you saw on the promo there is literally the state of knowledge of what we know about these incredible animals that we call the megafauna themselves. So the megafauna were incredibly diverse. There's probably around about 90 different species of megafauna, and these are typically very large organisms. So when I say large, we're talking about animals like the big, shaggy, four-legged marsupial that you can see, not on this image at all, but one of the depictions walking around, a thing called Diprotodon. Diprotodon was about my height or so at the shoulder, probably from me across to the other side of the room, so 3 or 4 meters in length, and weighed around about 3,000 kilograms. So that was probably the combined weight of everybody in the room, plus half the people on Zoom at the moment. So there was a seriously big animal. So there was big kangaroos that you saw, giant lizards. We also had Komodo dragons, believe it or not, living in Australia at early times during the Quaternary itself. Incredible things. There's a marsupial lion that you can see in the left-hand side over there as well. And marsupial lions are kind of like wombats that have turned bad across about 20 million years of evolution or so, because wombats are the closest living relative. Yeah, that was one of the top carnivores of its time itself. Now, one of the issues that I have with a lot of the kind of modeling stuff that I was talking about, so we call that the big data approach, is a lot of times we really don't know that much about the organisms themselves. And to kind of put that into a context, I think it's important to go back to the history of the discovery of the first megafaunal fossils that we have in Australia. Now, when I was just playing around just yesterday, I was looking at the website for the society itself, and I came across the most striking image that you can see. Now, this is an object that's held by the society. This is Sir Thomas Mitchell's paint box itself. And I haven't seen it myself. I've only seen the image of it, but I think it's a really wonderful kind of artifact from the from the 1830s, 1840s, whenever Mitchell was doing his thing. So Mitchell, if you don't know him, he was basically a British surveyor of the eastern part of Australia itself. Now, this is very striking to me in terms of the context of the megafauna, because it was Mitchell himself and Mitchell's party back in around about 1830 or 1831 who found the very first fossils, at least the first Europeans, let's clarify, found the first fossils of things like megafauna here in Australia. So they were working in an area called the Wellington Caves in kind of central eastern New South Wales, and they went into one of the caves and they found some bones. Now, back in the early days, there was no such thing as a museum or a scientific society or a university or anything like that. So what would happen back in those days, the bones would be collected by people like Mitchell and Leichhardt, if you know his story as well, I'm sure you do. And they would send those bones over to places like England. And there was a bloke over in England called Richard Owen, or Sir Richard Owen later. And Richard Owen is very famous because he is a British mammologist or anatomist, but he is also the person that came up with the name dinosaur. So he's super uber famous in that respect. Now, it was Owen who ended up looking at the bones that Mitchell had found himself, and he described these things as the bones of things like giant Tasmanian devils that used to occur on the mainland. There were giant kangaroos, and there was Diprotodon at the same time, so the giant four-legged shaggy creature that I was talking about. Now, what Owen did, he wrote a letter and he sent it back to Mitchell, and then Mitchell had that letter published in his journals in 1838. And that's a copy of the front page of Mitchell's 1838 journal right there. There's 2 volumes in this thing, and that represented the very first scientific paper that had ever been written in Western scientific literature about any aspect of the fossil record or paleontology of Australia. And it's the one that described things like Diprotodon. I just put in a couple of other little landmarks. That's Cunningham's Gap that you can see there. So the 2 peaks on the left-hand side of the gap, they're named after Mitchell. So he's quite a substantial character in the field. I also put that in there as well, because if you go through Cunningham's Gap and you go up onto the other side, you go down into the Darling Downs region, kind of between Warwick and Toowoomba up there. And that has been one of the most incredible megafauna fossil localities anywhere across Australia itself. I was reading a little bit further into the early history of megafauna, and in particular in the context of the society itself. And I came across this wonderful paper from 1900 by James Thomson, who should be familiar to most of the people here because he was the founder of the society and one of the early presidents back in the day. And he published some wonderful reconstructions on the basis of the information that he had available to himself at the time of what some of these animals look like. So the depiction that you can see on the screen there is Diprotodon, our giant 3,000-kilogram marsupial friend. This is a cousin of Diprotodon, a thing called Zygomaturus, a very ugly-looking beastie. And here we have the marsupial lion, or Thylacoleo, that I was talking about before. So I just copied these out of his 1900 contribution that was published in the Society's own journal, which I don't think operates anymore. I think it went out in about 1992, 1993 or so. And I really love this because what Thomson was really doing here, he was working with the data and the information he had in order to be able to reconstruct what these animals were all about. And if you can think about it, back in those days, there was no such thing as the internet. He didn't know much about the kind of fossils that were being collected and sent over to places like the UK for study. So he was really relying on whatever knowledge and information he had at his fingertips. Now, these images that you can see on the screen at the moment, they look a little bit cartoonish, but what I really like about them is that they do capture elements of the biology and the ecology of these animals. So if you look at Diprotodon, it's a 4-legged animal. Yeah, absolutely, it's no problem. It's eating some plants. It was herbivores. He's capturing that. The Zygomaturus in the left-hand corner down there, the cousin of Diprotodon, big, squishy kind of head, and we know that that's what it looked like. We don't know much more about it, though, because we don't have really fantastic fossils of these things, even at this day and age. And the marsupial lion that you can see there on the right, a big, ugly-looking thing, but they've captured the dentition perfectly well, where you can see those big chisel-like front incisors and those more kind of bolt cutter-like premolars that we have at the back. And so he was able to capture some of that, our ideas about what these things look like back in the day. And I've actually brought in, sorry. I'm having a good night tonight. And I've actually brought in a Dilaccoleo skull to show everybody. It's actually it's actually cast, and I should have got this prepared a little bit earlier, but I was drinking too much tea and talking too much. So this is the cast, and you can see exactly what Thompson had captured in his images. So I'll show this onto the Zoom for people to see, but we can see the big front incisors right towards the front there. And these were really well developed, very strong and very rigorous tools for dispatching prey. And we had these big premolars that were used for basically slicing and dicing, cutting through bones and things like that. So that's what the sort of size for the skull that we're looking at there. Now, you'll think that after another 130 or so years worth of collecting, we'd have a pretty good grip on what these organisms are really all about, but we don't. And this is the beauty of the documentary that captured what we do know about these animals. And I'll show you what we don't know very, very, very soon. Now, when it comes down to those extinction questions, it really comes down to those two things I was talking about before. Were these animals driven extinct by the first humans that set foot in Australia around about 60 or 65,000 years ago? Now, the premise behind this idea is that humans may have come in, overhunted these things to extinction. Maybe they burnt the landscapes and caused changes in the bush, and that was detrimental to the persistence of these things. On the other hand, we know that climate was hugely impactful across the entire Quaternary itself. In fact, the definition for what the Quaternary is comes down to the big glacial and interglacial cycles that we see across that last 2.5 million years itself. So was it that climate change that was associated with those shifts that caused the extinction? Now, according to Thompson's paper, he was pretty sure on the basis of his understanding of the way that our continent worked. I know this is very hard to read, but he's basically saying climate was the killer of these big animals themselves. But it's a very, very long-running debate. We don't have a clear answer to any of these things because despite, again, all of the work that's happened across the last 150 years or so, we don't have a very good grip on what these animals are all about. So Diprotodon, if you take this just as an example, so we know that that's what Diprotodon looked like. It was a very big quadrupedal or four-legged animal. The skull alone got up to around about 1 meter or so in length, so it was absolutely a beast. But if you're thinking about, like, let's ask the question, how many reliable dates do we have for Diprotodon fossils across Australia? And keep in mind that Diprotodon is also one of the most widespread members of all of the megafauna that we're talking about. So you find fossils of these things up in places like Cairns, down in Tassie, Central Australia, and a site that I'll show you very soon, all the way in Western Australia. So it's very, very widespread, but we've only got around about 20, what people might consider to be reliably dated fossil records of these things. Now, if you think, okay, 20 fossils, is that enough to really test some of these extinction ideas? Well, Diprotodon's had been around for about 2 million years or so. So on average, we've got a dated fossil record of a Diprotodon on average every 100,000 years or so. And that's kind of like a very coarse resolution if you're trying to test a very extinction hypothesis that has a very specific and pinpointed piece of geological time itself. Now, many organisms, and I'm not making this up at all, this is the ninja turtle itself. So ninja turtles were real animals, and there was a herbivore. There's only ever been 2 fossils found of the ninja turtle, and they've both been found on the Darling Downs, somewhere between Warwick and Toowoomba itself. It's only represented by the skull and the tail club that you can see at the back. So we don't know even what this animal looked like. And we have exactly 0 dates for the ninja turtle itself. And when I say ninja turtle, it's literally the ninja turtle. The scientific name of this thing is Ninjames oweni, or Owen's Ninja Turtle, it translates as. So it's obviously named after the cartoon rather than the other way around. But if you have a look at all those 90 different species, most of the megafauna have chronologies that look a lot more like the ninja turtle, where we have 0 dates for them than they do for things like Diprotodon. We've only got about 20 reliable ones. And we just don't know what these things look like still. And this is the same challenge that Thompson had when he was writing in the Society's Journal back in the day. He didn't really know that much about what these organisms look like. Now, this is a study that my team and I published just 18 months ago or so. And this is a partial skull of a giant wombat called Ramsaya. And when I say giant, this is probably about 250 to 300 kilogram wombat. Now, in comparison today, modern wombats get up to about 40 kilograms. So that's why we're calling it a giant. But you can see the front of the skull is represented by the incisor tooth. We have the eye socket up the top, and then the lower part, the lower bone down there, and those kind of things that, those long, skinny-looking things are actually teeth. Now, that's the most complete specimen of this entire wombat that has ever been found itself. And we found this up in Rockhampton in a cave near the Capricorn Caves Tourist Park, if people know where that is. But we know nothing about it. That's easily the most complete. We don't even have a complete skull. We don't have a complete mandible. We know nothing about its limbs, its vertebrae. We don't know how it walked around. We don't know anything really about its diet. It's very difficult and challenging. That's probably what it would have looked like, something like that. Now, one of the big things you often hear as well, particularly from the people who are more interested in things like the modeling rather than aspects of biology, is that they'll often make an argument and they'll say, big animals like megafauna did not suffer extinction until we get into the late part of the Quaternary itself, when humans turned up, therefore it must have been humans. Now, that's a fine hypothesis if you want to ignore the scientific literature and the fossil record itself, because a lot of animals, particularly going back even 3 million years ago, that were very, very large, and some of the biggest kangaroos that ever existed, probably at least as tall as that, if not taller, they suffered extinction by about 3 million years ago. So it's not true that big animals are not susceptible to things like climate change itself, because these things went extinct in the absence of humans. Now, there have been a couple of studies that have come out in the last couple of years, though, looking at megafaunal bones from much younger time periods than that. So this is an example of a leg bone of a bird called Genyornis, and that's a screenshot from the ABC documentary there of Genyornis. So Genyornis was a 350 kilogram bipedal, so two-legged bird, flightless bird. Looks like an emu, definitely was not an emu. It's more closely related to things like chooks than anything else. But here, this is a paper that was published by Phoebe McInerney, who was at the time a student down at Flinders University in South Australia, and she showed on the right-hand side there a healthy-looking leg bone of this particular bird, and on the left-hand side a bone that had some kind of bony, cancerous type of disease, the sort of thing that often comes about when you have these animals living in stressed, drought-affected types of environments themselves. So these big animals are absolutely affected by things like droughts. This is a study my team and I had published last year. I won't go into this one very much, but this is a fascinating thing for me. But we end up finding the lower jawbone of a kangaroo, and this particular kangaroo, again, 2.5 to 3 meters tall, like massive kangaroo. But you can't really see it in this image here, but it has a disease, a condition known as lumpy jaw, or macropod progressive periodontal disease, or MPPD, I think it is. This is the oldest evidence of this particular type of disease, and you often find it in modern kangaroos, when kangaroos are living through these drought-stressed types of environments themselves. So again, we got evidence of climate and droughts and things like that absolutely affecting and causing diseases in some of these big animals themselves through time. One of the final problems, I think, with a lot of that big data, kind of data mining approach, is that when you have a look at the distribution of the sites that are often used to feed into the extinction models, there's a huge bias, and the bias exists right there. So this is the distribution of the majority of the sites that are used. So if you think about it, we know almost nothing about the northern half of the entire continent itself. And Australia is a big place. Only got 4,000 or 5,000 kilometres across or so. And that's a huge, huge gap in knowledge. And that's a gap that I want to try to address with some of you today, because we do have fossil sites north of that line, but a lot of the times they're not very well studied. They're not dated a lot. And there's a lot of things that are just waiting to be discovered if we have an opportunity to go into those areas. The other funny thing that you think about too, like if I was to give you a full-on plot of all of the megafauna fossils that have been found across Australia, across the continent, that date to the time period that I'm talking about at the moment, you'd find a beautiful correlation between fossil records and where people live today. So we know about what was happening in Brisbane, we know what was happening around in Sydney, around in Melbourne, around in Adelaide, around in Perth. But our continent is so sparsely populated as well that a lot of the people don't live in some of these areas that are posing some of the most important and interesting questions when it comes to things like what happened to the megafauna. And so that's what I want to talk about a little bit today. And one of the sites that I was very lucky to go to, and I've had a wonderful relationship with a family called the Camps for many years now. They have a big cattle station just south of Burke Town, up in the southern part of the Gulf of Carpentaria. And they've got the most wonderful fossils that are found out there. And I'm not going to tell you what this thing is, But this is a fossil that we found there on our very last trip just a couple of years ago. And we were walking along, and I just happened to look down on the ground, and I could see a very interesting object, and I recognized it immediately. I want to tell you what it is, but I'm not going to. I recognized it immediately as the bones of a particular type of organism. And you can see the scale bar there. That's around about 25 centimeters or so long. And the bone is represented kind of like the splotchy, weird looking thing in the middle of the screen itself. So he spent the rest of the day trying to dig it out. And I'll just show you what it looks like in the field when we're doing excavations. So the whole object there is around about, I don't know, so 60 or 70 centimeters long. That's a former student that we had in one of my classes who volunteered. So if you ever see Jurassic Park as well, remember the Jurassic Park people sitting around with their brushes at the start looking at the big complete skeleton with Diprotodon? That is the stuff of Hollywood. That doesn't exist at all. But this doesn't really exist very much either. So I was very lucky to be in a situation where we've got such a wonderful specimen. It's almost a complete skull of the thing. And we basically spent the entire day digging around it, trying to get it up out of the ground itself. And we did it. I mean, it's back in the lab now over at the University of Queensland at St. Lucia. And I want to tell you about it, but I'm not going to. But the thing about it, though, is this thing represents something that's completely brand new to science. So it's a brand new species that nobody has ever even considered before. It's not only a brand new species, but a new genus as well. So a genus is like if you say Homo sapiens, it's the Homo part. So this is something that we're going to have the honor of getting to name at some point in the future. And when this thing comes out, this is going to completely rewrite our understanding of the ecological history of our continent itself. So it is that significant. But the point of me talking about this at the moment is not just for a little bit of clickbait, but it's to show you that concept and highlight that concept where we know almost nothing about so many parts of our continent itself. And when we go there, we make these insane discoveries. And must be so many more discoveries that are waiting underground beneath our feet. And it's just a matter of getting on the ground and going out to these places. Now, another site that I want to talk to is right down in the south here, down in Mount Gambier in South Australia. So it's not too far from the South Australia Victoria border itself. Now, Mount Gambier itself is known as one of the most insane areas for cave diving anywhere across our continent, at least, and certainly among the planet as well, for that matter. Now, the area is kind of like Swiss cheese. If you cut it in half, you'd find these incredible caves and the limestones that are down there. And a lot of the caves are absolutely full up with water itself. And our team, you might have seen the little promo from ABC before. You could see some people diving. That's part of a project that I'm also involved in. And we've been going down there the last couple of years under the support of the Australian Research Council, looking at this untapped resource, diving down into the caves, looking for bones beneath the surface there. Now, I am very happy to go into the dark, into a crawly, claustrophobic kind of space, as long as it's a dry cave. I do not like wet caves at all. But this is a particular cave. I just want to show you what it's kind of like on the ground and in water. And this is called the shaft, this particular system. And it's just literally a shaft in the middle of a cattle paddock. And the guy in the fluoro there, a guy called Joe Monk. Joe is from the Cave Diving Association of Australia, CDAA. So they're our partners in this particular project. And I put my life in the hands of people like Joe and the other members of that society, because if I didn't have them and we didn't have them, there would be no project and I would probably be dead right now. But I'll show you how this kind of stuff works. So in this particular instance, there's only one way into the cave and one way out, and that is to be friends with Joe. So Joe will look after you as long as you're friendly to Joe. So this is a student, Meg, who's part of our project. So she's a PhD student just descending down into the cave itself. If I can make this play. You hear a little bit of screaming, but she was safe the whole way, I can guarantee you that. So Meg is actually a diver, but in this case, she wasn't allowed to dive in that cave, with snorkeling only. So when I was talking to Joe about this cave before I went in as well, Joe described it as being like, imagine you were at the NCG sporting ground and you were descended down right in the middle of the stadium, and that's how big the cave is underneath. And I didn't believe Joe at all until I saw the map. And this is what the cave map looks like. So the hole that you saw Meg just go in is that tiny little white bit right up in the middle of the cave map itself. And this is the whole cave in the cross section itself. And so what Meg and I and a few other people were doing, we were just snorkeling around that tiny little white bit. It's around about maybe 20 meters across or so. But the whole rest of the cave is around about 200 meters across. So it's absolutely massive. So it literally is as big as the MCG. Now, there are a lot of caves in the area. One of the things that we find more than anything are bones that you can see in that left-hand corner there. So a lot of the times the bones of things like domesticates, so horses and cattle and sheep and goats and things like that. And so we often find these things, but these are important too, because if you can study them and understand how they make it into the cave kind of fossil record itself, then we can take our understanding of those modern processes and apply them to things like understanding the megafauna bones when we come across those. And this is just an example from our field trip back in March. I was just absolutely blown away. This is a different cave now called Tank Cave, and I absolutely will not go snorkeling in here. Now, to get to the fossil site here, the divers that we work with, which are predominantly from the CGAA, the organization itself, these guys here will dive for about 45 to 50 minutes just swimming across about a 900-meter area, across these honeycomb type of passages beneath the surface itself, complete darkness, complete water. They'll go and find a bone zone. They'll collect some bones, as much as they can carry, which isn't usually a lot, and they'll swim back again. So they've got a round trip of around about 2 hours, 2.5 hours or so to do the collecting. Now, on this particular trip, some of the guys brought up some bones that look just like what you saw a second ago, these long brown bones. And I could see them in a white kind of Hessian-y kind of bag when they brought them up. And I just presumed that because they were big and brown and fairly complete, that was probably going to be another horse, another cow or something. But I was absolutely blown away when they took them out of the bag. And what we've got here at the top is a femur from this animal called Palaeocestes. So Palaeocestes is otherwise known as the marsupial tapir. It kind of looked like the tapir that we have today, but was a cousin of Diprotodon, so it was a marsupial. So femur just being basically your thigh bone, okay? And the bone that you can see down the bottom there is a humerus, or the upper arm bone itself. Now, I was blown away, firstly, because of the quality of the preservation. Secondly, that we probably got a single individual that's buried down there beneath the murky waters of this particular cave. And again, how little we know about this animal. There are exactly a total of 0 complete skeletons of Palaeocestes that have ever been found in the 150 years or so that we've known about this animal. So the bone at the top, from memory, represents the 3rd or the 4th specimen of a femur for Palaeocestes that has ever been found. And the bone at the bottom, I think that's around about the 5th or the 6th specimen ever found. So again, like if you get underground and you go to some of these areas where other people aren't going, you can find stuff. Now, the final site I want to touch on really quickly, if I can, is a site all the way in Western Australia over here that I've been working at, a place called Cape Preston. And this particular project has been supported by a local natural resource company called Citic Pacific, and they're an iron ore company. If you know anything about the iron ore story with mining in Western Australia in the last few years, a lot of mining companies are on the nose, particularly because of some of the things they've done to, unfortunately, destroy things like Indigenous artifacts and culture itself. Now, this particular company, though, I'm not supporting them. They don't pay me to support. They just support some of the field work itself. But I'm very impressed with the work that they do in the local community. They're not as big as some of the other organisations. So it's called Citic Pacific itself. They're very much into the environmental side and looking after protecting the culture of the Indigenous community in the area itself. And they're interested in helping tell the story of megafauna at the same time as well. So this is a very ugly looking lower jaw of a Diprotodon that my colleague Kenny Travion collected a couple of years ago. And Kenny is the curator of mammals at the Western Australian Museum. And he got in touch with me because my thing is Diprotodons and dating and quaternary and megafauna extinctions and stuff like that. And that's not really what Kenny does. But Kenny invited me up on the field trip with the support of Citic Pacific. And we go up there and we come across the most incredible landscape. I mean, it doesn't look like much. It looks very barren when you see it for the first time. But it's basically an old creek. The orange bank that you can see out in the distance is slowly eroding away over time. But when you start walking along and you look down on the ground, you can see an incredible number of bones. And that is my big boot up on the left-hand side. There was a big bone of one of the Diprotodons. So we've got around about 20 individual Diprotodons that have been found in this locality. None of this is published at the moment, so you guys are getting a very sneak peek into it. Now, the excavation work out here is very difficult. We only ever dig under the advice and the support of the local Indigenous people. So they'll come and they'll sit with us and they'll tell us where to dig, and we'll go back and forth with that. I know this won't look like much to most people, but this is a complete skull of a diprotodon. So this is around about 1 meter or so in length. Those two curved banana-looking things at the front, they're the incisor teeth of the diprotodon itself. But the work is very difficult. Incredible number of fossils, but really, really hard to get out of the ground. This is like digging through concrete here, and that's not an exaggeration. That specimen alone, if it was on the Darling Downs, would have taken me maybe half a day to get out the ground. Here, it took about 10 days to get out the ground. So it's very, very difficult kind of work. It's climatically very hot at times. So in that particular trip, we were dealing with temperatures of around 43 degrees, and 43 degrees brings a lot of flying friends. And that's the back of one of the videographers that we had out there. That's me. One of the things you can't really see very well in this photo is the number of flies literally underneath my glasses in my eyeballs. This is the best photo of any wildlife I've ever taken. There's a diprotodon in the background and an interesting organism in the foreground, and any idea of some of the temperatures that we're dealing with. So every day is like 42, 43. And this was around about October as well. So you can imagine how difficult it would be working out there in the middle of summer, particularly for the mining company and the workers there. We had a press conference on site on this particular day. We had all the major kind of news channels coming up, politicians, all that sort of stuff. 43 degrees. It was a very funny old kind of time. And some of the Indigenous programs, I'd love to talk to you about this, but I really don't have time at the moment. But really wonderful connection to community and country. And that's me teaching a group of around about 10-year-old boys as part of an aftercare program that is run in Karatha, around about an hour north of the area itself. One of the best teaching moments I've ever had in my life. It's such a wonderful experience. This is an example of what the creek looks like. The grey bit that you see at the top there is basically the outcrop, so where the bones are broadly coming from, and all of the little dots and other things, they're the bones of the diprotodon. So we've got around about 20 individual diprotodons that have died in this particular environment. The thing that's amazing, though, is not just diprotodons, but we do find other megafaunal animals as well. And this is the lower jawbone of a giant wombat called Phascolonus, which is kind of similar to that wombat that I was talking about before, where we don't know that much about it. I forgot to take a photo of this, but we have things like emus, and we also have crocodiles as well. So this is a crocodile scoop, or part of the crocodile skin bone that you see at the back there. But that's not the thing that makes this super sexy to me. What is super amazing is the ecosystem that these things are found in, because it was a mangrove ecosystem. So what we've got are terrestrial organisms mixed in with the mangrove environment. And the evidence for that comes from things like the fossilized roots. So these are examples, the sort of circles that you can see there are things called pneumatophores. So if you've ever gone for a walk in Moreton Bay, for example, and you go and see some of the mangroves out there, the vertical roots that pop up out of the ground, that's an example of a fossilized one there. And what's happened in that case is that you've had the root come up, cementation, so carbonate cements have evaporated out from the seawater itself and basically locked that root in. Then the root itself has decayed and left a hole behind. We can see examples of trunks. This is a hard one to make out, but there is a black and white scale bar up the top there. So some of these trunks are quite big, and we have these kind of long lateral roots at the same time. We find examples of mud whelks that are exclusively found in mangrove environments, telescope snails and things like that. Lots of different snail species that you can see through here as well. So we've got an absolutely no-brainer. It's absolutely a mangrove type of ecosystem that we're dealing with. Lots of different types of clams. The object that you see on the left there is actually a diprotodon bone with oysters growing on the top of it itself. And these oysters are probably about 120,000 years old or so. You can find fossilized crabs and shrimps and things like that. And, you know, when we go and visit some of the modern mangrove environments in the area as well, like we can go and see these things living as they are today. We don't have diprotodons in there, but we can see the same sorts of mangrove plants that would have been occurring back in the day. We can find the snails, we can find the crabs, and we can even find bones. And that's just an example of the pneumatophores that I was talking about, the aerial roots. Gore alert, so don't have a look if you don't want to see something too gory, but this is what we think could be one of the models that might explain how things got into this particular locality. So if you've ever seen a David Attenborough documentary with wildebeest leaping through these crocodile-infested rivers in parts of East Africa, a lot of times this happens, unfortunately. So they die and they bloat and they get sent and pushed downstream, particularly during floods itself. That is one of the competing hypotheses that we've got at the moment to potentially explain what is actually going on. And we've got a little bit of work to do. We had an honours student, a guy called Jade Williams, who finished a project recently, and his idea was that maybe instead of having a big catastrophic event where this whole herd got washed down and caught up within the mangroves, maybe it was just like one or two animals were getting picked off like year after year after year. So it was more of a gradual type of thing. You know, he's probably right. It's a very hard hypothesis to test, but that's what we're going to be working on at the moment. Now, the other cool thing, and I don't want to get too technical with this, some of this stuff, is that we can find different episodes of mangrove ecosystems as we go through time. So if you have a think like a mangrove ecosystem doesn't grow in the middle of a desert. It doesn't grow on the top of a mountain. It grows at the intertidal zone. So mangroves are a proxy or a stand-in for things like sea levels, right? So they don't grow anywhere else except at sea level. So when we do our mapping out in the area itself, we're walking around mapping mangrove fossils, mapping oysters, mapping the bones of these giant animals, we can see that we have ecosystems that are preserved at different elevations as we go through, and this corresponds to different changes in sea levels as we go through time. So we've got mangroves up there, mangroves here, mangroves and megafauna here, and then mangroves and megafauna at the main accumulation that I was showing you a second ago, stretched out over a distance of about 250 to 300 meters or so. Stopped. I don't know what. It started again. But if you can make out that kind of 15 to 20 to 30,000 year period, sea levels dropped as far as around about 120 meters below what they are currently today in vertical height itself. Now, when we think about, okay, well, when did this mangrove ecosystem exist? There's only certain times that it could have existed, and it's those times when sea levels were high enough. So it could have been in the last 10,000 years, but probably not. We think these things are extinct by then. It could have been around about 120,000 years, or basically anywhere that kind of blue or grey line dissects those curves that you can see we're going to be working on in the coming years as well. Anyway, so that's three little insights to the megafauna extinction story that nobody else knows about. So nobody in this room is allowed to tell anyone, especially you people on Zoom. But anyway, so thank you so much for having me here. And that's a little bit of a bite and insight to not only the documentary itself, but some of the aspects that we work on in the debate. And it's very nice for me to be able to share that. Of course, I'd like to thank so many people, like the Indigenous groups that we work with, the mining companies Pacific, and of course, ABC Catalyst itself. Now, if anybody's super interested in it, ABC Education, which is separate to ABC Catalyst, also put together some really wonderful education resources for children from sort of grade 4, 5 up to about grade 10 or so. Again, you can scan that thing or just type into Google ABC Megafauna Education, something like that, and you'll find these wonderful resources, little short videos on lots of these animals and some of the interviews with the scientists, so some of the science behind the stories themselves. Anyway, thank you very much, everyone.
Gilbert, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating, and some live demos as well. We'll now go to some questions, both those online and those here in the room. Does anyone have one they would like to open with? We'll start in the middle and go back and forward.
I was surprised you never mentioned rivers, because in my limited knowledge, having been a high school science teacher, we always had the gospel that Riversley is the greatest fossil find in Australia.
Yeah.
Followed closely probably by Narracode in that area down there. So is it just that Riversley fossils aren't megafauna?
Yeah, Riversley, for anyone who doesn't know, is right up in the northwestern corner of WA, and I've actually worked a fair bit up there myself. Riversley is special along with Narracourt, and Narracourt is not too far from Mount Gambier where we do the cave diving. But Riversley and Narracourt together, they make up a World Heritage Site. So that's a significant, as the Great Barrier Reef or Stonehenge or whatever from the paleontology perspective. Most of Riversley itself dates from about 10 to 20-ish or so million years. There's only one single locality up there that is within the time frame that we're talking about today, a place called Terrace Site, and we know so little about it. You know, the researchers who are working on the project, and I'm not working on it myself anymore, but people haven't gone up there since the 80s or so. So we've had all these amazing new dating techniques that have come about in the last 30 or 40 years that need to be applied to that site. It's only the one locality though at the moment. So maybe it's a case that we need more people on the ground, more funding and that sort of thing until we have more of an answer for that. Yeah.
Question out behind.
Thank you. Thanks so much for a fantastic presentation tonight. And my daughter and I absolutely love the catalyst.
Yeah, great.
As well.
Yeah,
Really enjoyed it. So in terms of what happened to the megafauna, but is it your thesis that climate change was the main responsible reason that they disappeared?
I don't know. I mean, we're missing so much data on in order to be able to test these hypotheses. So we don't have enough dates. A lot of the organisms that we talk about have never been dated. You need more than dates to understand an extinction. It comes down to biology, ecology. It comes down to archaeology, geography. So many different things that we just don't have a grip on a lot of the stuff. What we do know is that big animals have been driven extinct over time through things like climate change, including at Riversley as well. We know that big animals throughout the Quaternary have been affected by climatic change. We don't know anything about ecological interactions between humans and megafauna of any kind. And that's not to say there wasn't any, but there was no evidence of anything. And, it would shock me if, one of the first people to walk into our continent came across a diprotodon or a giant kangaroo and didn't think, that's a bit of a meal right there I could be diving into. It wouldn't shock me if things were hunted, but is that evidence of a human-driven extinction as well? And so there's so many questions involved in it. To me, there's a lot more important questions, though, than the question of extinction. And a lot of those questions come down to things like, what is the consequences of not having big animals in an environment anymore? A lot of the times, big animals are what we call keystone herbivores or keystone species, where they have massive impacts on all other organisms in the landscape. And we can see that in places like the Serengeti, for example. Like if you look at, the wildebeest or your zebra, they're massive grazing animals. And as they're driving around and doing the seasonal migration, not only are they changing the vegetation, but they're creating opportunities for other smaller bodied herbivores that are coming behind them that might come and start eating the green shoots, as an example. And then there's the interaction with things like big predators. But, what happens when you don't have big animals anymore in the environment? What are the consequences for what happens next? And if you let me just bang on a little bit more, from my perspective as a paleontologist, a lot of people say, Ninja turtles are weird, diprotodons are weird, marsupials are weird, but they're not weird at all. That's normal. That's geologically normal across timescale itself. What's not normal is to have our biggest native herbivore in Australia to be a kangaroo, because that has not been the case for most of the last 25 million years. It's always been something like a diprotodon or a cousin. It's not normal for the biggest predator to be a bloody placental dog, like a dingo. That's not normal. That has never happened until about 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. And up until that point in time, or before that, like when the megafauna were around, the biggest main killing machines on our continent were big reptiles. So it was land-based crocodiles, it was the big lizards, it was big snakes. So our ecological history is so different today. People don't realize that, and yet we're still living in exactly the same time period as diprotodons and everything else. There's a lot bigger questions than what happened in terms of extinction.
Question down here.
Gilbert, how do you take these fossils? Is it from the sedimentary layers there?
Yeah, lots of different methods. So sediments are very important. We can date sediments using a variety of techniques. One technique is called optically stimulated luminescence dating. So I think one of the things I should stress first is most people have heard about radiocarbon dating or 14C dating, and that is a dating method that is applicable to some aspects of what we're talking about here, but it has a chronological range from yesterday until about 40,000 years ago. So it can't tell us what's happening at 70 or 100,000 years ago or 200,000 years ago. So there are other dating techniques. So things like the optical dating method for sediments. I specialize in a technique known as uranium series dating, and that's basically looking at how radioactive isotopes decay along the uranium series, if you know much about chemistry.
Uranium in the bone?
Yeah, they are. So your bones don't have them, and my bones and his bones and nobody else's bones. But when an organism dies and gets buried, it starts to suck up what was in the burial environment itself. And a lot of times it concentrates different types of elements, such as uranium itself. And if you have an animal that is buried and you collect it and bring it to the laboratory later on, you can count the number of various uranium isotopes and the daughter products along there, and you can figure out how old things were. Well, in that particular case, it might be considered to be a fossilization age. But there's lots of different techniques that are out there itself.
Cool. We do have a question from online from John Fairbairn. Based on the sea level diagram earlier, there's a lot of data out there on the continental undersea plateau, potentially, which we just can't see now.
Yeah,
Or
that's a wonderful, wonderful point, because when humans arrived in Australia, like, our coastlines aren't normal. It's not normal for us not to be able to walk to Papua New Guinea. 90% of the last 2.5 million years, we could walk to Port Moresby from Cape York if we wanted to. At other times, probably 60% of the times, we could walk all the way from Melbourne down into Hobart, just as an example itself. So our coastlines are very, very different, and we happen to be living in a time that we call an interglacial, and basically the sea levels are at a high stand at the moment. So our coastlines look very different to what they were 50, 60,000 years ago when the first humans arrived in Australia. So there's a lot of parts of our continent that are underwater these days. No doubt that the very first people that would have come into Australia, that would have utilised a lot of times things like coastal areas close to the coast as areas for food and shelter and things like that. Most of the Great Barrier Reef didn't exist 50 or 60,000 years ago, and there was no Great Barrier Reef at all 20,000 years ago. So the modern Great Barrier Reef is very, very geologically young in its configuration. No doubt the animals were living out in those ecosystems and those environments at the same time as well. So since that particular time, sea levels have come up and inundated those areas today, and we would lose a lot of very important information beneath the sea. And that's another thing that's not always considered in a lot of the extinction arguments. So it's a very important point.
Building on that, how do you actually select or find a good site for this? You've spoken a lot about caves in the south and up around Rockhampton. Outside of those environments, is there any particular factors that would make somewhere suitable for fossils to be?
Yeah, first, I think the first thing you want to do is, there's lots of different things, like just have relationships with people, relationships with people on the ground, because there's only so much, someone working in a university or a museum or whatever can do. So a lot of times we rely on members of the public finding stuff. So you've got to have a good relationship with people. If you wanted to go and explore randomly, looking for bones, you'd use things like maps. And maybe people here know about geological maps, but a geological map is just a map that has the different types of rocks that you might expect to find on the surface itself. So most fossils are found in sedimentary rocks. So for example, if I found a geological map that had granite, which is an igneous rock or basalt, which comes from volcanoes, I wouldn't go to those areas targeting bones in the first instance. I'd go to those areas that would have sedimentary rocks. With the mapping as well, the mapping can inform things about dating. And so if I'm interested in megafauna, I'm not going to go to a 100 million year old sedimentary deposit as an example. So it kind of works a little bit like that. There's lots of different ways to get out and about. And there's sometimes, things just happen by chance as well. Like you find things unexpected when you go to certain areas. So, yeah.
Any other questions from the floor?
Gilbert, in one of your graphs there, you had the elevation over time. From my point of view, just looking at it, it looked very regular. Is it or
no? So you're talking about that mangrove plot, maybe, where I had the mangroves and the megafauna.
No, you had an elevation
sea level plot.
Oh, the sea level plot. No. Whoops. No, that is so firstly the sea level curve that you can see here. So this is purely the vertical height relative to where we are today. So 0 is where we are. The darker line in the middle is the mean of where sea levels probably were, and the two grey lines on the top and the bottom of the darker line.
But it looks very regular to me.
Oh, yeah, I understand what you're saying now. That's a good point, because one of the things that's characterized by the entire Quaternary itself, particularly for the last 750 or so thousand years, is that we do have these regular shifts. Roughly every 100,000 years ago, you've got an interglacial. For example, 100 to 120,000 years here, we have an interglacial. Before that, another 100 to 120,000 years, we've got another interglacial, and so forth as we go back through time itself. That's only been a case for the last 750,000 years ago, though. When you go back in time before that, those shifts, the amplitude was a lot smaller, and they'll be shifting at rates of maybe every 40,000 years, something like that. So there have been these long-term changes that have driven those those overall changes across the
They're
change.
associated with astronomical change.
Yes, they are. Yeah. So these are things called Milankovitch forcings. So Milankovitch forcings was Milankovitch himself was a physicist back in the early 1900s, and he was modeling the way that the planet basically orbits or moves around the sun. So sometimes the path around the sun isn't always a nice sort of circle. Sometimes it's oval. So depending on how close you are to the sun, you might get extra sunlight at different times of the year. The planet itself also moves on its axis a little bit from about 22 to 24 degrees. So sometimes it's really kind of facing into the sun, sometimes it's not. And the planet also kind of wobbles around on its axis as well in the same kind of way as like if you've got a spinning top and you spin it out on the ground and it starts to lose its energy, it starts to wobble all over the place. And so Milankovitch took all those different factors and he was able to model what he predicted to be the different climate shifts that would occur through time. And amazingly, what Milankovitch was able to determine was temperatures and the amount of sunlight changing the climate of a planet, very similar to the physical evidence we have today. Now, all of the evidence that you can see on the screen here, that's actually determined on the basis of marine organisms that have been collected from deep marine cores in parts of the Indian Ocean itself, particularly over at the Red Sea close to Arabia itself. Dating of these things, looking at the geochemistry, figuring out if they lived in warm environments or cool environments and times and things like that. And so the physical evidence that we're getting for the climates really matches up well with the whole orbital type of thing too. It's really, really funky kind of stuff.
Okay.
Gilbert, thanks very much. Might be a silly question, but with the large herbivores, how do we know they were so large eating vegetation? And just before you answer that, there's a big program of reintroducing bison into Canada, parts of the US back onto the national parks and plains because of that need for a large herbivore in the cycle.
Yeah. Okay. So the first question: how do we know that things were big? And a lot of times we can draw an analogy to things that we think are big today, like a grey kangaroo, a red kangaroo, and if you've got a bigger tibia, for example, we can scale that up. Sometimes we use a little bit more quantifiable approaches. So, for example, if you've ever heard of like a mouse to elephant plot, these are basically where people have taken and measured the mass of a mouse and then calculated the size of its bones and the size of its circumference of its femur, for example, or the length of its upper arm bone or whatever. Done that for all these animals from a mouse to an elephant, and they can see that there's this wonderful scaling relationship all the way through. So what you might do then is take that data set and say, okay, dicrodon, how big was the dicrodon? Take those same measurements and plug it into the formula and see what it comes up as. And that's fine. That's a brilliant and very simple and straightforward approach. But the problem is that dicrodon is one of the best known members of the megafauna. How do you apply that technique or that approach to the ninja turtle? How do you apply it to most of those other species that existed out there? We don't know anything about them. Like that giant wombat I was talking about, you got parts of its skull. We don't have any leg bones at all. So, we can say it's probably 200 or 300 kilograms. And that might be a kind of like an eyeball type of guess, but it's sort of a guess at the same time. It's not informed. Now, what you're also talking about is a concept called rewilding. There have been ideas about rewilding in Australia, believe it or not. So there was a suggestion around about 10 years ago of bringing in endangered, I think, white or black rhinos from Africa into Australia. So they're at risk of things like poaching and habitat loss in places like Africa today. Maybe they would do okay as an ecological substitute for a diprotodon. They're about the same size. They're herbivorous. They're quadrupedal, so walking around on all fours. We also have problems with African grasses that have been introduced into Australia as well, and maybe they could take care of some of those issues. So a bit of biological warfare going on. I don't know if that stuff would ever happen here. I don't know what will happen with Canada. There's suggestions as well. They call it Pleistocene Park in places like Siberia, just like Jurassic Park, but reintroducing animals like Asian elephants or even hippos or rhinos into these areas where their cousins used to exist in the past. But, I don't know what's going to happen in the future in that space. But it's we're living in a time where we have a lot of ecological challenges. And I think a lot of times we need to start thinking outside the box. And we have this insane record of extinction in the same geological period that we're living in at the moment. It'd be bonkers to me to ignore what we have on the basis of the fossils and not just try to think differently and try to do something innovative using our understanding of the past.
Any more questions? Ralph?
Has there been any comparison between Australia and the Americas in relation to megafauna?
Definitely.
Given that humans have been in Americas even less shorter time than they've been in Australia.
Yes, yeah, there definitely have been. And that was the big points of comparison back in the 60s. So this whole idea that humans came into the Americas and wiped out all these, woolly mammoths and the saber-toothed cats came about then. And then that whole idea was started with the Americans, kind of spread across the rest of the place. Australia is super different though, in that we are not connected to anywhere else in the world. No matter how much you drop those sea levels, 130 meters, we are, along with New Guinea and Tasmania, we are isolated to everywhere. If you drop the sea levels, maybe even, 40 meters, you can walk from Alaska across to Siberia if you want. So you've got connectivity. That's how humans got their way into the Americas themselves, and they went down from there. It's a very different place. It's a very different context. And the organisms that we have here in Australia as well are so different. Like we're a continent dominated by marsupials. Marsupials are mammals that have a completely different type of reproductive strategy to the placentals. Ecologically speaking, like I sort of alluded to before, like the long-term big apex predators that we had in places like Australia were dominated a lot of times by reptiles. There are big land-based crocodiles. There was giant inland freshwater crocodiles as well, for that matter. There were the Komodo dragons. There was the giant bigger lizards and all that sort of stuff. So again, ecologically, that didn't happen in North America at all. It actually did happen in South America to a degree, but that ecosystem environment suffered extinction around about 20 or so million years ago, so a lot older than this sort of stuff. But there is a lot of very interesting comparisons you could make, I think. Maybe not with what happened in North America earlier in the Quaternary, but maybe other parts of the world, maybe other geological timescales as well.
Given we're at time-wise, does anyone have any final question they would like to ask? If not, we will wrap it there. Gilbert, thank you again so much. Fascinating, and I'm looking forward to it.
And I've got the marsupial line if anyone would like to have a look at this up close. Yeah.
Perfect. For those online, thank you for joining us. We'll see you again very soon. For those of you here with us this evening, we do have some light refreshments available at the back. Check out the website, more events coming up, and we hope to see you there. Thanks, everyone. Good night.